Hello, and welcome to CFUV's Climate Jam, a series on exploring technologies that can be used to combat global warming. My name is Jason Grenier, and I am producing a series of interviews on solutions to climate change with the assistance from the BC Sustainable Energy Association. Their website, bcsea.org. Today I have with me Stephen Salter. He is the president of Farallon Consultants Limited. Stephen Salter is an industrial ecologist and professional engineer who helps communities find practical ways to reduce their consumption of fossil fuels and their greenhouse gas emissions. Stephen concentrates on finding energy and water infrastructure options that are both ecologically and economically more sustainable than the status quo. Stephen was educated at the United World College of the Atlantic in Wales and the University of British Columbia, and has studied sustainable water and energy installations in Sweden, Brazil, India, Canada, and the United States. As president of Farallon, Stephen has worked with over 100 clients in North and South America. Stephen, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Jason. Thank you for having me.
I want to just get started with something that you can elaborate on, and it's a concept I heard you say that the word waste or waste does not exist. It's something, waste is a human creation, and I thought that was such a powerful concept to me anyways, because in nature there's no such thing as waste. Could you elaborate on that?
What we're talking about is the center of the idea of industrial ecology. And so I remember walking on Pender Island in the forest and looking down and seeing a slug eating a mushroom. And I realized that the mushroom was eating debris from the forest floor, and that came from trees. And that eventually when the slug died, its body would become nourishment for the tree. And so in there I saw the complete cycle, just in one picture. And when you think about how a forest works, it doesn't require a dump. The only inputs to the forest are sunlight. Every quantity of water, of nutrients and carbon is cycled and recycled. In our cities, and the way we design our Western cities especially, we think of them as straight pipes. We extract a resource, we process it and use it, and then we throw it away. And so the thing that's very interesting to me about industrial ecology is that when we reduce waste, we produce two goods. For example, if you just think about recycling aluminum rather than putting it in the landfill, first, we're not causing a load in the landfill, and second, we're avoiding the environmental hits of producing aluminum from a mine. So there are two goods. And it's the same thing with energy, it's the same thing with water, it's the same thing with any material that you can think of. And so that's what attracts me to the business of industrial ecology.
Just to continue here with that, can we lead this into our introduction to industrial ecology and explain how it can help our environment?
Definitely. So again, going back to the forest, if the only input to drive the forest ecosystem is sunlight, and if on the other hand we run our cities as straight pipes, industrial ecology is asking us to look at the impacts on a life cycle basis. So for example, to produce energy requires a tremendous amount of water, regardless of how we do it. Some sources of energy consume more water than others. To clean water for drinking and to clean water as waste requires a huge amount of energy. So producing energy consumes water, consuming water consumes energy, and then to grow food, of course, we need huge quantities of water and huge quantities of energy, all of which is contributing to climate change. So all of these things are interconnected. That's the bad news in a sense. The good news is that if we do something good in one area, for example, if we improve the greenhouse gas emissions of food production, we also have a benefit for energy and for water. What's astonishing to me is to think about the real footprints that are difficult to see. So, for example, the shirt I'm wearing actually represents about 2,500 liters of water. It represents more water than I could drink in a year. That footprint isn't something I see. It's paid for by the country, in this case, that produced this shirt, being India, a country that actually can't afford that water. So when you look at the life cycle costs of food, water, and energy, you can really have your eyes opened concerning where we can do the most good. Another one that surprised me was how much carbon comes out of the business of heating our homes, which is just about 3 tons per household per year in Canada, and how much carbon comes from driving our cars, which is about 5 tons per household per year. But food, in fact, for that home has a footprint of about 8 tons of carbon per year. So food outweighs the house and the car, which means that if we shift the way we produce food, or if we shift what we consume, so away from red meat and a little bit more toward the vegetarian side, we could wipe out the equivalent of all the emissions from the car, or most of the emissions from the house. But these aren't things that are generally talked about. We have a lot of focus on energy conservation in the home, which is an incremental improvement and a good thing, but we have to look at the whole picture if we're really going to make an impact.
Now, how fast do we have to make this impact?
What I'm reading is that we are actually nearing the tipping point. Climate scientists are talking about a 20-year time frame, and so we have to act more quickly than we think we do.
Now, I want to get straight to your travels to Sweden and Brazil and India. Do you want to start talking about these countries and maybe how Canada can follow suit?
I'd be happy to. I went to Sweden in 2006 and to Brazil in 2011 and in India just earlier this year for the purpose of learning how they had managed to do better than we were for greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And I think I'll start, in fact, in the streets of Curitiba, Brazil. So Curitiba is about 2 million people, more or less. But back in the 70s, it faced a decision. The popular thinking in the day was that it should become a megacity like an American city with huge highways at the center of the community. So the idea was to take apart the quaint sort of downtown streets and replace them with superhighways. The mayor at the time, Jamie Lerner, was a new mayor, trained as an architect, and said, there has to be a better way to do this. And so he actually went in the opposite direction and began to close streets. And the first street he closed, Rua de Flores, the Road of Flowers, is still closed. When he did that, he did it in a very stealthy way on a Friday night when there were very few people around to see what he was doing, and he had his civic workers barricade each end of the block. On Monday, there was a huge outcry from the shop owners who said, you're going to choke off our businesses. We need to have cars coming through here. But within a few months, what they began to see is that the foot traffic more than made up for the lost vehicle traffic. And in addition to that, licensed vendors were able to set up their stalls on the road in that street, and it really became a plaza. And so what happened in a very short time is that store owners on either side of that road were asking for their streets to be closed as well. And so there's a case where something good was done for the environment. Less car traffic in the center of town, less smog, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, but actually a higher economic turnover as a result. In the streets of Curitiba, a second example now, they had a huge problem with waste that would clog up the storm drains, and they live in an area where they get tremendous flooding and tremendous storms twice a year or so. And so the solution, rather than to come up with a great big corporate idea, was just to offer to any individual a price for anything that they could collect. So recyclables like cardboard, plastics, paper, glass, and so on. And what came out of that were tens of thousands of individual entrepreneurs who simply bought or built a little cart and then went through the streets and collected the material, sold it to the city. In some parts of the city, the roads were too narrow for garbage trucks to actually go and collect what they call true garbage, in other words, not recyclables. And so they have a garbage exchange program where they will actually, in a sense, buy garbage from people at grocery stores. So people are encouraged to bring their garbage to the grocery store, and then they're given in exchange either bus tickets or pencils or paper for school or stamps for food. Either way, the cost of collecting the garbage is lower, and it also does a social good on the way. And so that's the streets. And then in terms of getting people around, he thought, we have to do something for mass transit here. We can't have individuals driving cars in Curitiba if it's going to grow and prosper. And at the same time, he knew that they could not afford, back in the 70s, to build a metro. And so he simply closed the center of the main avenues of the city and dedicated them to one direction for buses. The buses were specially designed for them by Volvo in Sweden, so they're articulated buses in 3 sections. They burn ethanol, which Brazil produces on its own, And the speed of these buses is amazing. In rush hour, 1 bus per minute will go through these main arteries. The cost of building the system was a very small fraction of what it would cost to build an underground system. And about 80% of people who live in Curitiba get to work this way every day. So it's a tremendous success. So better for the environment, less expensive for citizens, and it helps the economy grow because, of course, people can then afford to raise their families and to live in Curitiba. So it's a social good as well as an economic good. So I began to think, there's a bit of a pattern here. It seems that when this particular mayor was broadly thinking, had a broad perspective, looked for the best environmental good, it also was the best economic good. And I began to wonder if that was a theme elsewhere as well. One of my favorite examples from Curitiba has to do with the flooding. Again, they had a problem with flooding, which they were encouraged to solve by building channels. And so if you can imagine a concrete waterway, very wide, very deep, and generally not carrying very much water except for the flood season. That was the North American sort of standard way of dealing with floods. Instead, Jamie Lerner said to himself, flooding is a natural phenomenon. What if we simply open up the areas on either side of the rivers as parkland, and we'll call them linear parks. So there are 13 of these linear parks running through Curitiba. They're basically greenways. People, of course, can use them for walking, for running, for what have you, except for 2 or 3 days a year when they're flooded. Flooding being a natural thing, that water goes back into the ground, recharges the aquifers. But the green belt also has a cooling effect on the buildings nearby. And some critics were saying to him, you're going to lose the revenue that you could have collected in taxes from buildings on those greenways. But in fact what happened is that the high-rises, very high-density buildings on either side, increased in value. And of course more were built there because of the green amenities. So because they had a greater value, their tax flow to the city was higher as well. So it evened out. So these were some examples from, I thought, a very interesting sort of thought leader. And common sense is the common sense of necessity. He knew that the city couldn't afford high tech, so they used low tech, but to a great effect, I think.
You were talking about recycling and waste, and I was thinking of Victoria, or thinking of us in North America, and all the one-time use coffee cups and plastic cups and stuff. That's what they're recycling in
It's exactly the same material that we are, but their success, I'd say, is higher. With this very low-tech approach, they are diverting about 70% of all of their waste away from landfills. And here in Greater Victoria, we're about 46%. Metro Vancouver is about 55%. So they're actually doing better than we are, but with much less tech.
Just to keep going with our time here, I would like to talk a bit about Sweden. One of my favorite stories that you told in your YouTube video is you mentioned that an oil refinery in Gothenburg was going bankrupt until it started selling its heat to the energy company, and I mean, this just goes to show how Sweden values a green environment rather than a smog environment, if you want to call it that. So they do a lot with extracting heat from not only the oil company but sewage. Would you like to talk about that for a bit?
Yes, this example came from the city of Gothenburg in western Sweden, and the energy company there, Gaudy Energy, has a very interesting arrangement. They will scavenge heat from wherever they can, and in this case the source, or one of those sources, was an oil refinery. So they actually buy the waste heat from the refinery, and that made a significant difference to the economics of the refinery. It's ironic that that's actually where the heat came from, but that's only a fraction of all of the energy they recover. Other energy comes from biogas. Other energy comes from wastewater, heat pumps recovering heat from wastewater. The most interesting thing about that company is how it sells its energy. So if you owned a building in Gothenburg that was burning oil, and I'm Gothenburg Energy, I could approach you and say, I can connect your building to my district energy system and sell you heat at about 25% less than what you're paying today. You won't need a boiler. You won't need people to maintain it. I'll look after all of that for you. And I will guarantee to keep your building at 22 degrees C. And you would say, that sounds like a good deal to me because it's cheaper. And I would hook up your building. Part of our agreement, though, would be that as soon as you're connected, I will go in and actually retrofit your building. And the reason for that is that if you're paying me a fixed price to keep your building warm at 22 degrees, it makes sense for me as the energy provider to give you as little energy as I possibly can. You're paying me a fixed amount of money, so what I'm going to do is retrofit your building, re-insulate the walls, the ceilings, replace the windows, and so on. Put your building on an energy diet. So it's now using perhaps half the energy that it did before. That leaves more energy in my district energy system to sell to the next building. And so when I thought about that, it really meant that first the building owner is doing well. They're not emitting as much carbon dioxide as they were. Their costs are lower. But the energy company has a huge economic incentive to actually not sell as much energy. And that's quite different from the way we sell energy here in North America. So our utilities are only making money if we consume energy. And in Gothenburg, the utility is making money by not providing energy.
Yeah, we're 180 degrees backward here.
We are. Yeah.
Now, how about India? What would you like to talk about in India? What did you see there?
Well, when I went to Sweden in 2006, I thought I was looking for high tech, and what I saw was just cutting edge common sense because the tech was all old. And when I went to India, that was even more the case. There was no question of advanced technology making the big difference. It was very low tech. So what I saw, for example, were very small biogas digesters. So this would look like what we would think of as a water tank or large water tank. Sometimes you see them on the Gulf Islands that people use for rainwater capture. This tank would not be very big. It might be a cubic meter or a little bit bigger. It would sit just outside the house, and every food scrap from the house, all forms of organic waste from the house, would go into this digester. It would produce biogas, which is basically just methane, which would then be piped into a stove in the kitchen. And a small digester, about a cubic meter, would produce about 2 hours of cooking gas per day. The cost would be paid back more or less in about 5 years because the household then would not have to buy propane. And there are now something like 1.5 million of these digesters in India. And so when you think of all the goods, the first is they're not consuming fossil fuels for that purpose. They're reducing greenhouse gas emissions from food that would otherwise rot in a landfill, but in fact they're producing fuel from it. And then the material that's left over after digesting is compost. So it goes into the garden and helps improve the soil health. So what's happening on a big commercial sort of municipal scale in Sweden is happening at the household scale in India. And it's the common sense of necessity because it makes sense for people economically. They're doing it.
Do you think that these countries, Sweden, Sweden's not blessed with oil like we are, and also India and Brazil, do you think they started all their low-tech technologies because they had to, they were forced to, and maybe that's the reason we're not doing it in North America because we don't have to, although we should?
Part of it, I think, is economics, and part of it is ethics. So just going back to Sweden in the 70s with the first and the second oil shock, or the so-called oil crises, Sweden said after the oil began to flow again and prices went down, they said, well, this is temporary. We're not going to be in this position again. So what can we do to get away from oil? Norway, right next door, was discovering vast oil and gas reserves, and so their economy is very different. But the Swedes said, what can we do with what we have where we are? And that included, of course, looking at waste, looking at where energy goes once people throw things away. So that was partly an ethic. The other thing that they have, I think, is a deep connection with land. In Sweden, people have what's called allemansrätt, which is every person's right of access to land. So if I'm a farmer, you, Jason, would be welcome by law to walk through my farm, to camp, to eat wild berries. You wouldn't be welcome to eat my crops or to damage my crops, but you have access by law to my land. So this idea of what is my land is a bit different in Sweden. So what happens as a result is that people, even who live in high-rises in the city, will go out on weekends to camp in the land. They have a deep connection with land. The second thing is Swedes very much support the idea of preserving land for farming and preserving land for forests. So rather than having urban sprawl, which we have allowed to happen in North America. Cities tend to be more contained there. But I think probably the biggest difference is that senior government will set goals. So the Swedish EPA on their website, anyone can look, will have at any one time 16 or 18 high-level goals, the first one being to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So when I was in Sweden, they politely pointed out to me that our emissions, I think, were 20 tons per person per year and rising, and Sweden's are about 7 tons per person per year and falling. And so at the very top, they've had the idea of let's have an objective. And then they've steered taxes to guide cities to achieve those objectives. So they've had really the intent right from the very beginning. In India, I'd say it was more necessity, and in Brazil, it was very much more necessity as well.
Here in North America, it's not a necessity yet, but we don't want to wait until it becomes a necessity. But that's all the time I guess we have today. I just want to thank you for coming out.
Jason, it's my pleasure. Thank you.